morning Callum spent his last $7 on a stranger's coffee. He didn't feel noble about it. He felt tired. It was a Tuesday in late November, one of those days in Edmonton when the cold doesn't just sit on your skin. It gets into your joints, into the back of your throat, into the part of your brain that usually keeps you optimistic. He'd been standing in line at a Tim Hortons on Jasper Avenue for 10 minutes, rehearsing numbers in his head. Not affirmations. Numbers. The kind that don't lie. 17,000 left in his line of credit. 2 months behind on Lily's after-school program fees. The bid submission deadline was in 4 days, and he still hadn't heard back from the structural engineer he'd been chasing for 6 weeks. He was 41 years old, and he was ordering a medium double-double because he couldn't justify the extra 40 cents for a large. That was when he heard it. A soft, embarrassed sound, the kind a person makes when they're trying very hard not to make any sound at all. The woman ahead of him was looking at the cashier with that particular stillness that people get when something unexpected and humiliating has just happened in public. Her card had been declined. Not dramatically. The machine had just beeped once, quietly, and now everyone within 6 feet once. She was trying a second card. Her hands weren't shaking, but they weren't quite steady either. Callum looked at what she'd ordered, a medium coffee and a blueberry muffin. He looked at the total still glowing on the little screen. $6.87. He stepped forward and put his card on the counter before he'd fully decided to do it. "I've got it," he said, not loudly, just enough. The woman turned. She was maybe 35, dressed in the charcoal wool coat that had seen better years, dark hair pulled back, and eyes that were doing that thing people do when they're deciding whether to feel grateful or mortified. She looked at him for a moment like she was trying to figure out if there was a catch. There wasn't. He'd just done it. "You really don't have to," she said. "It's cold out," he said, which wasn't an answer but somehow felt like one. She nodded once, quietly, and took her coffee. He ordered his medium double-double, paid, and she was gone before the lid was even on his cup. He didn't get her name. He didn't think about her again that day. He had too many numbers to rehearse. Her name was Cersei Aldrin, and she sat in her rental car outside that Tim Hortons for 4 minutes after she left. She wasn't having a breakdown. She'd had her breakdown already 6 weeks ago in a parking garage in Calgary when she'd realized the scope of what she was walking into here. She'd already cried that out. What she was doing now was something quieter, the kind of sitting still that happens when something small and unexpected has shifted something inside you and you're not ready to name what it is. She'd been in Edmonton for 3 weeks. Nobody here knew who she was, which was exactly why she'd chosen to do the initial assessment in person rather than sending one of her deputies. It was also exactly why she'd taken the transit card instead of expensing the car service, and why she'd been eating at Tim Hortons and Famoso instead of the hotel restaurant. She wanted to see the city the way ordinary people saw it. She was thorough like that. Her assistant had once described her as pathologically thorough, and she'd counted it as a compliment. The credit cards had been flagged by her bank because she'd forgotten to notify them she was traveling, both of them simultaneously, because apparently her bank had a new fraud detection system that was very enthusiastic about doing its job. She had approximately $800,000 in her investment accounts, and she could not buy a muffin. The man had stepped forward without hesitation. She hadn't been able to read him at first. He wasn't performing kindness. That was the thing. He hadn't looked around to see if anyone noticed. He'd just done it, and then immediately looked back at the cashier to place his own order, like paying for a stranger's breakfast was just a thing that happened sometimes and didn't require any ceremony. She noticed his jacket was older. She noticed he'd ordered the medium, not the large. She'd said thank you on her way to the door, and he'd nodded, and that was all. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the address she had for the afternoon site visit. She thought about him twice more that day. Then she filed it somewhere and moved on. The project Callum had been working on for 14 months was not small. It was a mixed-use development on the north side of the river valley, 42 units of affordable housing stacked above a community health clinic and a daycare. It was the kind of project that didn't get built very often, not because people didn't want it, but because the math was punishing and the land deals were complicated and you needed someone who understood all 3 layers of the thing simultaneously: the architecture, the community impact, and the numbers. Callum understood all 3. He'd spent 8 years at a large firm downtown, learning how to make buildings that worked, and clients that were happy, and margins that made the partners comfortable. And then his wife had gotten sick, and then she died, and then he'd spent a year trying to figure out what he was still doing and why. And eventually the answer had come to him quietly on a Saturday morning while Lily was eating cereal across from him, and the radio was playing something he couldn't name. He wanted to build things that mattered, not just things that were profitable and appealing and met code, things that actually helped. So he'd gone out on his own. He'd found two partners, a community land trust and a non-profit health network, who believed in the project. He'd spent a year and a half doing the groundwork, the community consultations, the design iterations, the grant applications, the relationship with the city planning office. He had a site. He had preliminary approvals. He had a project that was genuinely good. What he didn't have was the lead contractor. The contract that would make or break the whole thing was sitting with Aldrin Capital, a development finance company out of Vancouver that had a new affordable housing fund they were deploying in Western Canada. The fund was chaired by someone named S. Aldrin, whose assistant communicated exclusively by email, who had not yet toured the site, and who Callum had been told would make a decision before the end of the year. He'd submitted his project package 62 days ago. He'd heard nothing. His contact at the land trust, a woman named Patricia who had been in this industry for 30 years and whose skepticism was a form of love, had told him to be patient. She'd also told him to have a backup plan. He was working on both simultaneously and succeeding at neither. His daughter Lily was 9. She wanted to be a marine biologist or a zookeeper or possibly a professional hockey player, depending on the week. She had his wife's laugh and her own particular way of looking at the world that he found, on difficult days, to be the most stabilizing thing he knew. On the night before the bid deadline, she'd fallen asleep on the couch with her library book open on her chest, and he'd stood in the doorway for a moment and thought, whatever happens, we'll be okay. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he thought it. He submitted the final package at 11:47 p.m., turned off his desk lamp, and went to bed. Sawyer Staw had not planned to be doing field work at this stage of her life. At 38, she was 6 years into running Aldrin Capital with a level of control and precision that had made her, depending on who you asked, either one of the most effective development finance executives in Western Canada or one of the most difficult. She didn't think these were mutually exclusive. She had a team of 12 analysts, 2 regional deputies, and a chief of staff named Yemi who could anticipate her next question before she'd finished the current one. She could have assessed every project in the Edmonton portfolio from a boardroom in Vancouver without setting foot on a single site. She'd come anyway. It had started as curiosity. The Affordable Housing Fund was her initiative. She'd pushed it through the board over 2 years of skeptical questions and conservative risk modeling, and she wanted to see what was actually happening on the ground. But 3 weeks in, it had become something else. She'd seen 6 project packages so far. 2 were strong. 2 were mediocre. One was a repackaged commercial development with affordable units as an afterthought, which had made her feel a specific kind of tired. And one, the last one she'd reviewed before flying to Edmonton, had arrived without a cover letter from a brokerage or PR firm. Just the work. Just the design, the community consultation records, the site analysis, the phasing plan, the letters from the health network and the land trust. She'd read it twice. She still hadn't responded because she wasn't finished deciding. She was thorough like that. She was also, and she didn't discuss this with anyone, in a period of her own life that was harder than she let on. The end of a 7-year relationship 8 months ago. A health scare that had turned out to be nothing but had left her with a new relationship to the concept of nothing. A growing sense that she had built something formidable and correct, and was not entirely sure it was what she wanted to have built. She wasn't falling apart. She was someone who did not fall apart. But she was looking at things more carefully than usual, including strangers who paid for her coffee without making it a moment. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Callum had submitted his package. It was from S. Aldrin's office, from Yemi, the chief of staff, asking if Callum would be available for a site visit and meeting on Friday at 2 p.m. It was a single paragraph, professional, no indication of which way the decision was leaning. He sat at his desk and read it 4 times. Then he called Patricia, who said, "That's good, that means they're considering it." "Or it means they want to reject me in person," he said. "Callum, I'm just being realistic." "Being realistic is not the same as being prepared. Go make sure the site is presentable." He spent Thursday doing exactly that. He also reread his project package twice, took Lily to her skating lesson, made pasta for dinner, and lay awake until 2 a.m., running through every question he might be asked and every answer he might give. He arrived at the site at 1:15 Friday afternoon, stood in the cold for a few minutes reviewing his notes, and then watched a dark blue rental car pull up to the curb at exactly 1:58. The woman who stepped out was wearing a charcoal wool coat. He recognized it before he recognized her face. And then he looked up and he recognized her face too, and for a full 3 seconds his brain did not know what to do with the information. It was the woman from Tim Hortons. She was already looking at him. She'd recognized him at the same moment he'd recognized her. He could see that. There was a flicker of something across her face, not discomfort exactly. Something more like recalibration. "Mr. Shaw," she said, coming forward and extending her hand. "Saw, where's Aldrin?" He shook it. "Callum," he said, because his brain was still catching up. "I know. I've read your file. A beat, twice." He wasn't sure what to do with that either, so he turned and led her toward the site. The tour took 45 minutes. Saw its last questions the way she did everything, methodically, without telegraphing where she was going with any of them. She asked about the setback variance and how he'd navigated it with the planning office. She asked about the structural decision to push the clinic entrance to the north face. She asked why he'd chosen the particular daycare operator he'd named as the tenant, and he told her about the 3 consultations he'd run with families in the neighborhood and what had come out of them, and how the operator had been willing to adjust their programming model based on what he'd heard. She wrote things in a small notebook, not constantly, only occasionally, which somehow felt more significant than if she'd written everything. At one point she stopped at the edge of the lot and looked out at the valley. The light was flat and gray, and the river was frozen. It was not a beautiful day, but there was something about the site, the way it sat at the top of the ridge, the way the design used the grade to let the residential units catch the south light while the clinic had a separate entrance from the street, that you had to see in person to fully understand. "You didn't hire a firm to put this package together," she said. "It wasn't the question." "No." "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I didn't want anyone else deciding what the story of this project was," he said finally. "It's mine. I've been inside it for 14 months. Nobody else knows what I know about it." She looked at him for a moment. "That's either very confident or very stubborn." "Probably both." Sondon shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. In acknowledgement. They went inside the temporary site office, a single portable trailer, and she sat across from him with her notebook and he answered everything she had. He talked about the phasing, the construction timeline, the contingency he'd built in for materials costs, the relationship with the city project manager who had been cautiously supportive for 11 months. He talked about the 2 design iterations he'd scrapped and why. He talked about the family on the street 2 blocks over who had come to every single public consultation and whose feedback had changed where he'd put the bike storage. He talked about Lily once, not as a strategy, but because it was true. He'd taken her to the 3rd consultation on a Saturday because his babysitter had canceled, and she'd sat in the corner drawing pictures of the building as she imagined it would look, and a woman attending the consultation had seen the drawings and asked Lily to explain them. And somehow Lily's 9-year-old explanation of what made a home feel like a home had clarified something for him that he'd been struggling to articulate for 2 months. He hadn't planned to say any of that. He said it because she was listening in a way that made him say true things. Sawyers didn't react visibly. She wrote something in her notebook. She asked what the drawing had looked like. "She put a garden on the roof," he said, "which is actually in the design. But she didn't know that. She just thought it made sense." Saw this, looked at the page in her notebook. "It does make sense," she said quietly. There was another project under consideration from the same funding pool. Callum didn't know this. His name was Brett Calloway. He was the director of development at a mid-sized commercial firm that had been pivoting to mixed-use residential for the past 3 years. His package was polished, professionally assembled, financially detailed, with a development record that included 12 completed projects and a contractor network that could mobilize quickly. His project was also, if you read it carefully, not quite what it claimed to be. Sawdust had read it carefully. The affordable units were sized at the minimum threshold, positioned on the lower floors with the least natural light. The daycare was listed as a confirmed tenant. When her team had called to verify, the daycare operator said they'd had one meeting and hadn't signed anything. The community consultation report cited 3 sessions with a total of 14 attendees across all 3, numbers that did not suggest deep neighborhood engagement. Brett Calloway had also, at the pre-submission networking event 6 weeks ago, told one of Sours's regional deputies that the affordable housing market was a loss leader play that was mostly about the government incentives. He hadn't known who the deputy was. He'd found out 3 days later and had sent a clarifying email that Sarse had read once and then set aside. She did not make decisions based on one overheard comment. But she also did not unhear things. She flew back to Vancouver on Saturday morning. She called Yemi from the airport and told her she needed the full due diligence file on the Shaw project ready by Monday. Then she sat in the departures lounge with her notebook open on her knee and thought about what it meant to build something that helped. The call came on a Thursday. Not from Ye, from Source directly, which Callum hadn't expected. "I'm going to be straightforward with you," she said. "We're approving the project. Full funding, on the terms in your package. You'll have the formal letter by end of day." Callum said nothing for a moment. He was sitting at his desk. Outside, it had started to snow. "Callum." "I'm here," he said. Yes, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. The conditions are standard, but they're real. I'll want quarterly updates. My team will do a site visit at each phase milestone. The daycare operator stays in the project as named." "Understood. And I'll say one more thing." A brief pause. "The package you submitted, the way you put it together, the community consultation record, the honesty about what you scrapped and why, that matters. Not just to this decision. It tells me something about how you work. I want you to keep working that way." He found he didn't have an answer to that, so he just said yes. After he hung up, he sat for a long time with his hands flat on his desk. Then he got up, put on his coat, and walked to Lily's school to pick her up in person instead of having her take the bus, because he wanted to tell her himself, and he wanted to see her face. She was standing outside with her backpack and her pink toque and her figure skates over her shoulder, and when she saw him coming she started running before she even knew why. "Did you get it?" she said. "We got it," he said. She threw her arms around him hard enough that they both almost fell over, and he held on to her and thought about all the mornings he'd stood in a Tim Hortons line rehearsing numbers and running out of optimism, and how none of those mornings had known about this one. Sawdust heard later, from Wahimi, who'd heard from her contact at the land trust, about the roof garden. That Lily's drawing had turned out to be almost identical to what Callum eventually built: tomatoes and marigolds and a bench facing south. She didn't mention that she'd known about the drawing already. She'd been there when he told her. She went back to Edmonton the following spring for the groundbreaking. She stood in the mud at the edge of the lot with a small group of people. Callum, Patricia from the Land Trust, 2 people from the Health Network, a handful of residents who'd come to the consultations, and she thought about what it took to build something real. Not the money, not even the skill, the willingness to stay inside something difficult long enough to know it the way Callum knew this. She also thought, briefly and without sentiment, about a Tuesday in November, and $6.87 and a man who hadn't looked around to see if anyone was watching. She hadn't told him that she'd recognized him the moment she stepped out of the car. She hadn't told him that she'd already read his package twice before she'd even booked the flight. She hadn't told him that something about the way he paid for her coffee, the total absence of performance in it, had made her read his file a 3rd time, slowly, in her hotel room the night before the site visit. She didn't need to tell him. It was enough that she knew. What she did tell him, at the small reception in the trailer afterward, when the speeches were done and people were warming their hands on paper cups of bad coffee, was something else. "You asked me once why I do site visits in person," she said. He looked at her. You don't actually remember whether I asked that. No, she said. But you should have. The answer is because you can't tell what something is from a file. You have to stand in it. He thought about that. Is that a philosophy or a policy? Both, she said, and this time she did smile. Outside, the May sun was catching the top of the ridge, and for the first time you could start to imagine what the building would look like when it was finished, where the south light would hit the upper units, where the entrance to the clinic would be, where a garden on a rooftop would face the sky. It was going to be something worth standing in. I keep coming back to the moment Callum put his card on that counter. He didn't know who Sarasa was. He didn't know she was 3 weeks into quietly assessing every affordable housing project in the city. He didn't know she'd already read his file twice. He just saw someone who needed $7, and he had $7. And that was the whole of it. No calculation, no angle, just a person deciding, in a small and unremarkable way, who he wanted to be. I think about that a lot, how the biggest turns in a life rarely announce themselves. They show up looking like nothing, a lineup at a Tim Hortons, a card that won't go through, a Tuesday in November when you're already running on fumes, and someone extends a hand anyway. What Callum had at his core was integrity, not the performative kind that people talk about in job interviews. The real kind, the kind that shows up the same whether anyone is watching or not. He built his project package himself because he didn't want anyone else deciding what story it told. He went back to the community 3 times, not because the grant required it, but because he thought it mattered. He scrapped 2 designs that probably would have worked because he knew they weren't quite right. That's not strategy, that's character, and character has a way of compounding over time, the same way debt does, quietly, steadily, until one day you look up and realize it's been doing work you didn't even notice. Sawyer saw it before she ever stepped onto that site. She saw it in the way he'd assembled his proposal, the honesty about what he'd abandoned and why, the letters from families who'd actually showed up to his consultations, the daycare operator who'd agreed to rethink their programming model based on what he'd heard in a church hall on a Saturday afternoon. She was looking for exactly that kind of rigor, the kind that can't be faked in a well-designed PDF, and she found it. But here's the thing I keep sitting with. Sayarsa had built something formidable too. She'd pushed the Affordable Housing Fund through a skeptical board over 2 years. She was thorough and exacting, and she did not miss things. She'd also, by her own quiet admission, started to wonder whether formidable and correct was the same as meaningful. She was looking for something she couldn't fully name, and then a man she didn't know paid for her coffee without looking around to see if anyone noticed, and something in her paid attention. That's the part that doesn't get said enough. Goodness has a kind of gravity. People feel it. They can't always explain why they trust someone or why a room feels different when a certain person walks in, but they feel it. Callum had earned Sarsa's attention before he ever knew he needed it, not by being impressive, but by being consistent. The roof garden is real now. Lily drew it before it existed. I don't think that's magic. I think that's what happens when a kid grows up watching a parent stay committed to something worth committing to. You start to be able to see things before they're built. You develop the imagination for it. That's what I take from this. Not a formula, not a lesson with 3 easy steps. Just a reminder that who you are in the small moments is who you are. And that's the thing people eventually figure out about you. Not your pitch deck, not your credentials. The Tuesday mornings when nobody's watching.